A millionaire humiliated a young stable hand over a wild stallion. Days later, he lost everything. 6 days later, Desmond Kane would lose the biggest business deal of his career, the prize stallion he'd paid a record sum to own, and the respect of every single person who witnessed what happened at Kane Manor that summer. But on the night this story actually begins, all Desmond Kane wanted was to make an example out of a 19-year-old girl in muddy boots, in front of a crowd of people who mattered far more to him than she did. He had no idea what that decision was about to cost him. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who had absolutely no idea who they were dealing with, this is a story you're going to want to watch until the very end, because what that stallion did 6 days later, in front of every investor Desmond Kane had spent a year courting, is the kind of reckoning you rarely get to see happen in real time. Kane Manor sat on 900 acres of rolling bluegrass in horse country, the kind of property that made magazine editors reach for words like legacy and empire. Desmond Kane had built his fortune in luxury real estate, the sort of self-made wealth that came with its own mythology, the man who'd started with nothing and ended up owning half a mountain range. He liked that story. He told it often, usually right before asking someone for a very large check. What he told less often, if he told it at all, was the part where his own father had lost their family's cattle operation in Oklahoma to a bank foreclosure when Kane was 12 years old, or how he'd stood in the yard and watched strangers load his father's herd onto trailers while his father sat frozen on the porch steps, unable to say a single word. Kane had spent 30 years since turning that helplessness into an almost violent need for control, buying, acquiring, owning, as if enough property might finally undo the afternoon he'd stood powerless in that yard. It didn't make what he was about to do to Sage Whitmore, or to that stallion, forgivable. It only made it, in its own quiet way, tragically familiar. That summer, Kane needed one particular check more than he'd needed almost anything in his life. A consortium of international investors was deciding whether to back his newest venture, a sprawling resort development along the base of the Ironwood Mountains, and Kane understood, with the instinct of a man who'd spent 30 years reading rooms, that spreadsheets alone wouldn't close this deal. He needed a story. He needed spectacle. He needed something that would make grown men in tailored suits stop checking their phones and simply stare. So when the State Wildlife Authority announced an emergency gather of the last free-roaming Mustang herd in the Ironwood Range, drought had pushed the horses too close to grazing land the state wanted protected. Desmond Kane saw his opportunity before the ink was dry on the press release. He didn't just want a wild horse. He wanted the wild horse. The herd stallion. Black as a starless sky, with a jagged white star between his eyes and a reputation, even among seasoned wranglers, for being nearly impossible to handle. At the emergency auction, Kane outbid every rescue organization and every rancher in the room, paying more for a single untamed animal than most people paid for a house. $310,000. For a horse nobody could touch. The local paper ran a photo of Kane standing at the auction podium with his arms crossed, looking, as one reporter privately put it, like a man who'd just bought the ocean and expected it to behave. Kane called it conservation. He called it heritage. What he meant, though nobody in that room said it out loud, was that he'd just bought himself the centerpiece for the most important night of his professional life, the gala unveiling that would close his investors, once and for all. There was just one small problem. Nobody had asked the stallion. The horse arrived at Kane Manor in a specially reinforced trailer, and it took 4 men, 2 tranquilizer doses, and the better part of an hour just to get him unloaded into a reinforced round pen without anyone losing a finger. He slammed against the panels so hard the whole structure groaned. His eyes rolled white. Every person on that property that day gave him a wide, respectful berth. Every person except one. Her name was Sage Whitmore, and she was 19 years old, and she'd been mucking stalls and exercising horses at Kane Manor for 8 months, ever since her grandfather's health had made it impossible for him to keep running the small horse rescue that had been in their family for 2 generations. Sage had grown up at a place called Whitmore Hollow, in the foothills just below the very mountains that Wild Stallion had come from. Her grandfather, Silas Whitmore, had spent 40 years taking in horses nobody else wanted. Old ones, injured ones, half-wild ones that had been failed by people long before he ever met them. He taught Sage everything he knew before a run of bad drought years and a mountain of unpaid vet bills forced the bank to take the land 3 years ago. These days, Silas lived in a modest assisted care facility 2 towns over, his lungs weaker than they used to be, and every dollar Sage earned at Kane Manor went straight toward keeping him there. She needed this job. She could not afford to lose it. Which made what happened over the following 6 days all the more remarkable, because Sage Whitmore was about to risk that job, and everything riding on it, for a horse that, by every account, wasn't even supposed to be her responsibility. She saw him for the first time on her second day back from a supply run, standing at the rail of the round pen while two of Kane's hired hands debated how best to approach him. The stallion was pressed into the far corner, sides heaving, one back hoof cocked and ready to strike anything that came too close. Everyone around Sage saw a dangerous animal. Sage saw something else entirely, a terrified one, doing exactly what any creature does when its whole world has been taken from it without warning. "He's not aggressive," she said quietly, mostly to herself. "He's grieving." Nobody heard her. Not yet. The only person who did hear her, eventually, was a wiry old horseman named Cyrus Boone, who'd managed the Kane Manor stables for going on 14 years and had outlasted 3 different head trainers, 2 of Kane's own divorces, and more expensive mistakes than he cared to count. Cyrus had a permanent squint from decades of sun and a way of talking that made every sentence sound like it had already been thought through twice before it left his mouth. He found Sage still standing at the rail after the crowd had drifted off toward the barn to argue about equipment. "You're right about him," Cyrus said, not looking at her, looking at the horse instead. "But you'd best keep that opinion to yourself around here. Mr. Kane doesn't pay for opinions. He pays for results, and he wants them by Saturday." 6 days isn't enough time to earn a wild animal's trust, Sage said. "It isn't enough time to earn anybody's trust." Cyrus almost smiled at that. "No," he agreed. "It surely isn't. But I've been here 14 years, and I've learned there's exactly 2 kinds of people who work for a man like Desmond Kane. The kind who tell him what he wants to hear, and the kind who don't last long telling him anything else." He glanced sideways at her, something like warning and something like respect crossing his weathered face at once. "Which kind are you fixing to be?" Sage didn't answer him that day. But 4 nights later, sitting alone in the dark outside that round pen with a wild stallion slowly closing the distance between them, she already knew. Desmond Kane had flown in a celebrity horse trainer named Trent Locke specifically for this project, a man with slick boots, a made-for-television confidence, and a philosophy built entirely around dominance. Round pen pressure. Rope and chain. Break the spirit fast, Trent liked to say, and the trust comes later. He had 6 days to get that stallion calm enough to stand quietly beside Desmond Kane in front of 200 investors and photographers, and he intended to get it done the only way he knew how. The first session was a disaster. Trent went into the pen with a lunge whip and a plan, and within 90 seconds the stallion was airborne, front hooves slashing down inches from Trent's shoulder as he scrambled backward through the gate. The horse's flank was bleeding where he'd caught himself on a bolt in the panel railing during the chaos. Trent, red-faced and furious, insisted the horse just needed more pressure, not less. Kane, watching from the fence line with his phone still pressed to his ear mid-call with an investor, simply said, "Fix it. I don't care how." Sage watched the whole thing from the barn doorway with her jaw tight and her hands curled into fists at her sides. That night, long after Trent and the hired hands had gone home and the main house lights had dimmed, Sage let herself quietly back into the barn. She didn't approach the pen. She didn't even look directly at the stallion. She simply sat down in the dirt outside the rail, in the dark, and stayed there, the exact same patient, wordless presence her grandfather had taught her to offer any animal too frightened to trust a raised hand. She did this every night for the next 4 nights, telling no one. By the second night, the stallion had stopped pacing the far fence line whenever she arrived. By the third, he'd let her sit within 20 feet without flattening his ears. On the 4th night, something happened that Sage would carry with her for the rest of her life. The stallion, cautious and trembling, lowered his head and took 2 slow steps toward her, close enough that she could feel the heat of his breath, close enough to see that the jagged white star between his eyes was shaped almost exactly like the one on a gelding her grandfather had rescued 15 years earlier, the summer she was born. She started calling him Solace. Just to herself. Just in the dark, where nobody else could hear. If you're the kind of viewer who believes that trust has to be earned in silence before it's ever proven out loud, stay with this one, because what Sage was quietly building in that barn at night was about to collide, in the worst possible way, with everything Desmond Kane had planned for that stallion in the daylight. The gala was 5 days out when Kane decided he couldn't wait any longer to see progress. He wanted a full run-through, the stallion, saddled and led calmly across the main lawn in front of the catering staff and event coordinators, a dress rehearsal for the real thing. Trent, still smarting from his first failed attempt, doubled down instead of backing off, bringing in a stud chain and 2 additional handlers to physically force compliance if the horse resisted. Sage found out only 20 minutes before it started, and by the time she reached the lawn, they already had the stallion snub tied to a post, his neck bent at an angle that made her stomach turn, his eyes wide and white-rimmed with panic all over again, every fragile inch of trust she'd built over 4 quiet nights unraveling in real time in front of a dozen strangers. "Stop," she said, louder than she meant to. "You're going to hurt him. Or somebody else. Please, just stop." The lawn went quiet. Trent looked at her like she'd interrupted a surgery. And Desmond Kane, who had walked out from the main house specifically to watch this rehearsal, turned toward the sound of her voice with an expression Sage would never forget. "Who let the stable girl talk?" he said, not even bothering to lower his voice, loud enough for every caterer and coordinator and hired hand on that lawn to hear him clearly. "You muck stalls. You don't train $1 million horses. Get back to work before I find someone who actually understands what's at stake here." It got worse from there. He told her, in front of everyone, that she was replaceable. That people like her, and he said it exactly like that, people like her, didn't understand what it took to build something real, to earn something real, the way he had. He told Trent to keep going. And when Sage, humiliated and shaking, tried one more time to explain that the horse needed patience, not force, Kane cut her off completely. "You're done for the day," he said. "Actually, you're done, period, if you say one more word. This isn't your family's little rescue operation. This is a business. Try to remember that." He didn't know about Whitmore Hollow. Not really. He'd glanced at her file once, seen family horse rescue, foreclosed typed in a summary somewhere, and used it like a blade without a second thought, without ever knowing what that land had meant, or what it had cost her grandfather to lose it. Sage walked away from that lawn with her whole body trembling, humiliated in front of a dozen strangers by a man who didn't know her name well enough to use it. She sat in her car in the staff lot for 20 minutes before she trusted herself to drive. Here's the part that matters most, though, the part that separates Sage Whitmore from almost anyone else in her position. She didn't quit. She didn't stop showing up for that stallion, even after being told, in the ugliest way possible, that her expertise meant nothing. That night, once again, long after everyone else had gone home, she walked back into that barn in the dark. Solace was waiting for her at the rail. Over the next 2 nights, something remarkable kept building between them, not because Sage had anything to prove to Desmond Kane, but because she understood something Kane never once considered. That stallion hadn't asked to be dragged off a mountain and sold like a trophy any more than her grandfather had asked for a drought and a bank to take the only home he'd ever built. She saw herself in that horse. And slowly, carefully, in the only language he'd ever trust, she kept showing him that not every human hand was one to fear. By the 5th night, he let her rest a hand flat against his shoulder for the first time. By the 6th, the morning of the gala itself, he let her slide a soft rope halter over his head without flinching once. Nobody at Kane Manor knew that yet. Because as far as Desmond Kane was concerned, Sage Whitmore had been quietly, firmly instructed to stay out of sight for the event. Trent Locke and 2 hired handlers would be leading the stallion out under the string lights that evening, in front of 200 guests and every investor Kane had spent a year chasing, and that, as far as Kane was concerned, was the end of the discussion. He had no idea what he'd actually built toward. And by the time the sun went down that evening, he was about to find out in front of everyone he'd ever wanted to impress. The gala itself was, by every outward measure, a triumph in the making. String lights wound through the old oaks along the drive. A jazz trio played near the terrace. 200 guests in cocktail attire drifted between past hors d'oeuvres and champagne, and near the center of the main lawn, a temporary arena had been built specifically for the evening's centerpiece, the unveiling of the last wild stallion of the Ironwood Mountains, standing calm and majestic beside the man who had saved him. That was the plan, anyway. Desmond Kane stood near the arena rail in a tailor jacket, shaking hands, laughing at jokes that weren't especially funny, glancing every few minutes toward the barn where Trent and his team were preparing to bring the stallion out. He caught the eye of the lead investor, a sharp-eyed woman named Adeline Whitfieldcho who represented the consortium that could make or break his resort deal, and gave her a confident nod. Everything, he assured her, was exactly on schedule. It was not. The moment Trent led the stallion out from the barn on a short lead, flanked by 2 handlers, the crowd's applause and the sudden bright pop of a photographer's flash sent a jolt through the horse's whole body. He'd spent 6 days learning, slowly and carefully, that stillness and quiet hands meant safety. What he got instead, in front of 200 strangers, was noise, lights, and 3 unfamiliar men gripping him tighter with every step. He bolted. The lead rope tore straight through Trent's gloved hands, burning a line across his palm, and the stallion exploded sideways into the temporary arena fencing, splintering a section of rail clean through. Guests screamed and scattered. A server dropped an entire tray of champagne glasses in a crash of shattering crystal. Somewhere near the terrace, a child was crying, and Adeline Whitfieldshire was already pulling her phone from her clutch, her expression shifting from polite interest to open alarm. Desmond Kane, in front of every single person he'd spent a year courting, watched his prize stallion, the centerpiece of his entire evening, the symbol of everything he wanted people to believe about him, tear across his own lawn in a full-blown panic, dragging a splintered fence rail behind him by a tangled lead rope. Kane did the only thing his instincts told him to do. He ran directly toward the horse, arms out, shouting for someone to grab him, and the stallion, cornered now between the shattered fence and a wall of screaming strangers, reared straight up, front hooves cutting the air just inches from Kane's chest. Kane stumbled backward over the broken rail and went down hard onto the grass in front of his own investors, his tailored jacket streaked with dirt, all his careful mythology about the self-made man who conquered everything crumbling in real time under 200 phone cameras. That's when Sage Whitmore came over the fence. She hadn't been invited. She hadn't been told to. She'd been watching from the barn shadows the entire evening, unable to make herself leave, and the second she saw the stallion break loose, every instinct in her overrode every instruction she'd ever been given. She dropped the fence rail she was gripping, stepped past a stunned Trent Locke, and walked directly toward the most dangerous animal on that entire property while 200 people held their breath. She didn't run. She didn't reach for him. She simply stopped about 15 feet away, lowered herself into the grass exactly the way she had every night that week, and started talking, low, steady, unhurried, the same voice, the same patience, the same wordless promise she'd been offering him in the dark for 6 nights straight. "I'm here," she said. "You're okay. Nobody's going to hurt you. I promise." The stallion's ears, pinned flat since the moment he'd bolted, flicked toward her voice. For 3 full seconds, nothing in that whole chaotic scene moved except his ears, swiveling, searching, remembering. Then, in front of 200 guests, a shattered fence, a dazed millionaire still sprawled in the grass, and at least a dozen phones recording every second of it, the wild stallion of the Ironwood Mountains lowered his head, walked the 15 feet separating them, and rested his forehead gently against Sage Whitmore's shoulder. The lawn went completely silent. And then it didn't, because that silence broke into something else entirely, a wave of stunned, disbelieving applause, phones still raised, Adeline Whitfieldshire standing frozen near the terrace with her hand pressed flat against her chest. If there's one image you take away from this whole story, let it be that one, not the chaos, not the broken fence, but a 19-year-old girl in muddy boots, calming in 15 seconds what an entire team of professionals and a small fortune had failed to do in 6 days. If a moment like that gives you chills, go ahead and hit subscribe now, because what happened to Desmond Kane over the following week is exactly the kind of reckoning that makes stories like this one worth telling. It turned out 200 phones recording the same chaotic scene was more than enough documentation for the whole story to unravel. Within hours, footage of the panicked stallion, the shattered fence, Kane's humiliating tumble into the dirt, and Sage's quiet, extraordinary intervention had been shared far beyond the guest list. By morning, it had climbed well past the borders of Kane's own social circle. Local news picked it up first. Then a wildlife advocacy group, drawn by the footage, began asking pointed questions about exactly how a private buyer had been permitted to remove the herd stallion, arguably the single most important animal for that Mustang population's genetic future, from an emergency gather at all, rather than releasing him back once the immediate drought danger passed. The questions kept multiplying. Reporters found the earlier footage Trent's own hired photographer had taken during that first disastrous training session, the one showing the whip, the chain, the bleeding flank. Someone found records of 2 prior labor complaints filed against Kane Manor that had quietly gone nowhere. None of it, on its own, was necessarily illegal. All of it, together, was devastating. Adeline Whitfieldshire called Desmond Kane herself 3 days later, and it was, by all accounts, a short conversation. Her consortium, she told him, had built its reputation on responsible, sustainable development, the exact language Kane had used to court them for a full year, and video of a screaming crowd, a terrified animal, and a stumbling millionaire covered in dirt in front of 200 witnesses was not, in her words, the kind of story our name gets attached to. The resort deal, the one Desmond Kane had spent a year and a small fortune chasing, the one that whole gala had been built to secure, was dead within the week. Other dominoes fell fast after that. 2 other business partners quietly distanced themselves. A Plan magazine profile was pulled before it ever ran. The Wildlife Authority, facing its own uncomfortable questions about the auction process, opened a review that would eventually recommend real changes to how future emergency gathers were handled, a small, imperfect step, but a real one. And Desmond Kane, the self-made man who'd built his whole public identity on the story of a person who conquered everything through sheer force of will, found himself, for the first time in decades, on the losing end of a story he could not control, spin, or buy his way out of. He lost the deal. He lost the magazine feature. He lost, by his own accountant's later estimate, nearly everything he'd leveraged to make that gala happen in the first place, forced to sell off pieces of Kane Manor itself just to stay solvent. 6 days. That's all it took to unravel 30 years of carefully constructed mythology, because underneath all of it, the truth had simply been waiting for enough people to finally see it. As for the Stallion, that part of the story, thankfully, went very differently. In the chaos of Kane's unraveling finances, the wildlife advocacy group that had raised the initial questions negotiated something nobody expected. The Stallion's release from private ownership entirely, transferred instead into a newly formed non-profit sanctuary trust. And when it came time to decide who should be named as the sanctuary's founding caretaker, there was only ever one name anyone seriously considered. Sage Whitmore signed the paperwork on a bright morning 3 weeks later, standing on a stretch of foothill land not far from where Whitmore Hollow used to be, purchased back with sanctuary grant funds and a small mountain of community donations that had poured in after that gala footage went around the world. Her grandfather Silas, out of the assisted care facility for the first time in months on a special day pass, stood beside her at the new round pen fence, his oxygen tank humming quietly at his side, watching a black stallion with a jagged white star graze peacefully in afternoon sun that fell across land that finally, after 3 hard years, belonged to their family again. "What are you going to call this place?" he asked her. Sage looked at the stallion, the one who'd once been sold for the price of a house and treated like a prop, the one who'd chosen, in the middle of total chaos, to trust exactly one person in a crowd of 200. "Solace Ranch," she said. "Seemed right." If this story reminded you that real strength usually looks like patience instead of power, and that the people the world underestimates are so often the ones who end up changing everything, we'd love to hear which moment stayed with you longest down in the comments. And if you believe a little quiet trust can outlast even the loudest kind of arrogance, share this story with someone who needs the reminder today, and subscribe so you're here for the next one, because somewhere out there right now, another Solace is waiting for the one person patient enough to finally see him.